see a permissions note come up to start recording, and now we're going to hand over to John to actually do the introductions. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Can you hear me okay? Great. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you are like our distinguished speaker in North America. Welcome, everybody, to this very promising meeting of the Charles Lamb Society. Absolutely. In a moment, I'll introduce Judith, but I want to begin by introducing our Elian reading. And this is going to be done by David Watkinson. I'm delighted to welcome David Watkinson, who is a barrister and also a devotee of Charles Dickens, John Thelwall and Charles Lamb. He's certainly got very good literary taste. And David's going to give us today's Elian reading. And it's from the Old Benches of the Inner Temple, which was published in the London magazine 200 years and 1 month ago. So pleasingly, David is a member of the Middle Temple, and his chambers were previously situated opposite the Middle Temple Gardens and just down the steps from Fountain Court. And that tees up his reading nicely. So David, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, John. So I shall start straight away with the extract from Charles Lamb's essay, The Old Benches of the Inner Temple, published in the London magazine, September 1821. I was born and passed the first 7 years of my life in the temple. Its church, its halls, its gardens, its fountain, its river, I had almost said, for in those young years, what was this king of rivers to me, but a stream that watered our pleasant places? These are my oldest recollections. I repeat to this day no verses to myself more frequently or with kindlier emotion than those of Spenser, where he speaks of this spot. There when they came, whereas those bricky towers, the which on Thames' broad-aged back doth ride, where now the studious lawyers have their bowers, there whilom wont the Templar knights to bide, till they decayed through pride. Indeed, it is the most elegant spot in the metropolis. What a transition for a countryman visiting London for the first time, the passing from the crowded Strand or Fleet Street by unexpected avenues into its magnificent ample squares, its classic green recesses. What a cheerful liberal look hath that portion of it, which from 3 sides overlooks the greater garden, that goodly pile of buildings strong, albeit of paper height, confronting with massy contrast the lighter, older, more fantastically shrouded one named of Harcourt, with the cheerful Crown Office Row, place of my kindly engendure, right opposite the stately stream, which washes the garden foot with her yet scarcely trade-polluted waters, and seems but just weaned from her Twickenham naiads. A man would give something to have been born in such a place. What a collegiate aspect has that fine Elizabethan hall, where the fountain plays, which I have made to rise and fall, how many times, to the astonishment of the young urchins, my contemporaries, who, not being able to guess at its recondite machinery, were almost tempted to hail the wondrous work as magic. A later extract in the same essay. The artificial fountains of the metropolis are fast vanishing. Most of them are dried up or bricked over. Yet where one is left, as in that little green nook behind the South Sea House, what a freshness it gives to the dreary pile. 4 little winged marble boys used to play their virgin fancies, spouting out ever fresh streams from their innocent, wanton lips, in the square of Lincoln's Inn, when I was no bigger than when they were figured. They are gone, and the spring choked up. The fashion, they tell me, is gone by, and these things are esteemed childish. Why not then gratify children by letting them stand? Lawyers, I suppose, were children once. Why not gratify them indeed? They are awakening images to them at least. Why must everything smack of man and mannish? Is the world all grown up? Is childhood dead? Or is there not in the bosoms of the wisest and the best some of the child's heart left to respond to his earliest enchantments? The figures were grotesque. Are the stiff-wigged living figures that still flitter and chatter about that area less Gothic in appearance? Or is the splutter of their hot rhetoric one half so refreshing and innocent as the little cool playful streams those exploded cherubs uttered?
Thank you very much, David. I think that warrants a virtual round of applause. That was a terrific start. Thank you so much, David. Thank you. Okay, now let's turn to Judith Thompson. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Judith Thompson of Dalhousie University, who is a good and long-standing friend of the Charles Lamb Society and an absolute stalwart of the John Thelwall Society and of Thelwall studies in particular. Judith is the author of John Thelwall in the Words of Circle 2012, and she's recently retired from Dalhousie, and she tells me that she's going to devote herself to artistic and creative pursuits. So good luck with that, Judith. But she will be teaching an online class next month on Thelwall's novel, The Daughter of Adoption, at Otto Friedrich Universität in Bamberg. I'll put fuller details of that event in the chat if you want to attend. Judith is going to be talking today about her forthcoming biography of John Thelwall, the romantic radical, poet, friend, polymath, and linguist. And Judith's title today is In the Theatre of Romantic Eccentricity, John Thelwall in Covent Garden. So over to you, Judith, and welcome.
Thank you, John, and thank you also for that lovely reading, David, and thanks to everyone at the Charles Lamb Society as well. Okay, and I believe Adam will be doing my starting with the PowerPoint that will go along with my talk. So I'll get that started with a little orientation. I love maps. So here's one of the Covent Garden area in 1746. You can see the Theatre Royal at the top middle, St. Paul's with its portico shown in the painting in the center, and down the bottom right, the landmark Beaufort buildings, nerve center of 1790s radicalism. And now here's a different kind of map of my biography. I'll begin by performing excerpts from 2 of the fictional vignettes that introduce and separate its 7 sections, each highlighting a different stage and persona in Thelwall's incredibly varied, still largely unknown life. So here is the first paragraph of vignette 1, The Fabric of Life. Black Genoa velvets, striped and figured Florentines, dove-colored lustring, scarlet naps, Norwich crepes, brocades and bombazines, printed dimities, princes' stuffs, prunellas. The sounds of the words danced in his head even more brightly than the swish and shimmer of the fabrics themselves as they crisped or billowed colorful off the bolts to meet the neat snick of his father's shears. As a tiny boy, he would listen from below the counter, where his father sometimes lifted him up as on a stage, to prattle and take a bow for the dignified actor, gentlemen and ladies, who ruffled his hair and said that such a fine young man would surely join them one day at the Theatre Royal. A little older, gawky and restless, he would dart past the shelves and showcases of his great uncle's fashionable shop, into the back warehouse and courtyard, more comfortable with the workmen, carters, tailors, and weavers, bringing and taking their wares. He listened to their tales and complaints in a drama that spilled into the bustling streets and piazza and under the portico, past glossy storefronts and squalid stalls, finicky shopmen and burly draymen, peddlers and performers, Punch and Judy brought to life. This was his theater, with a cast of hundreds, their entrances and exits, comedy and tragedy, voices chivying and chaffing, exhorting and chastising, the music of a world in motion. And now a bit of Barbarossa, which introduces section 2, Adventurer, and picks up about 10 years later. You wouldn't credit it to see him in a moment of rest, so slight with that shock of dark, unkempt hair and long nose pouting down over his lisping tongue. But then he never was at rest, possessed of a relentless energy that gathered every eye to him like iron to a magnet. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, arranging boxes in the far corner of the shop, daubing backdrops, draping fabrics, telling his friends where to stand and how to speak, a book in one hand, the other thrust out in the studied gestures he had copied from other books. Not but a cocky upstart, really. But Miss Young had to smile in spite of herself, remembering how she felt at his age, plying her needle while dreams of Shakespeare's heroines ran through her mind. Rosalind, Viola, Imogen, girls who wore the breeches and spoke with tongues unconfined by chains of society. They moved with ease from spindle to sword and back again, with a power denied to her. Her good fortune led her to Mr. Garrick and the stage on which she had satisfied her ambitions. And so she indulged young Thelwall's eager vanity, standing to the side and letting him lead the show, even when his directions outpaced his actor's abilities, with no understanding of how it would work on a real stage. Let him learn. Now, amid the half-covered bolts and bales, he was practicing the scene between young Selim and his faithful friend Othman yet again. But where is Barbarossa? I expected this evening to rehearse Zafira's confrontation with the fell destroyer in Act 2. Where do you think, Miss Young? Answered Phil, rolling his eyes. For John had, of course, cast his brother William in the role of the arrogant pirate king. The elder Thelwall boy did not take well to the younger's instructions, and usually came late, if he arrived at all, with a smell of brandy and self-important excuses on his breath, rehearsing his power better than he knew his lines. At least he suited the part. Well then, Master Thelwall, in a moment, let us go over your disguised reunion with Zafira in Act 3. But before this, a few notes for you to consider. Do not forget to grant her a little wisdom and space to take center stage. She is a queen, a mother, and a heroine. She needs no man to rescue her. Her noble firmness and resolve alone have kept the usurper and murderer of her beloved lord and king at bay for fully 7 years, while Selim, her son, has been in exile. Her moving eloquence of woe is a weapon keener than swords. The play is a trial of love, you know. In the mouth of Barbarossa, that word is no more than a lie. But she defeats him in the perilous debate, deflecting and defining it justly. In truth, she shows it matters less than her heart in the great climax. No tyrant's threat can awe the free-born soul that greatly dares to die. So that was Elizabeth Young, a leading actress at the Theatre Royal, Covent Garden, who lodged above the Thelwall family silk shop on King Street, where tickets for her benefits at Drury Lane nearby were sold between 1773 and 79. And Thelwall did put on a performance of John Brown's hit play Barbarossa in the back of that shop, probably around 1778 or 9, when he was about 15 years old, roughly the age that the famous Master Betty was when he performed it 25 years later, and that was in the previous screen. But the rest of this vignette, like the first one, is fictional. As you may have guessed, I'm taking Miss Young as a bit of an alter ego to help me do what these vignettes are supposed to dramatize the life of Thelwall, like the screenplay that everyone, or at least my non-academic friends, tells me I should be writing. I want my biography to walk the line between critical and popular, partly because that's what Thelwall himself did, and partly because, geez, his life has all the ingredients of a Hollywood blockbuster: towering ambition, relentless persecution, heroic integrity, eternal romance, scandalous passion, eccentric originality, a little bit of farce for comic relief. It's just such a good story, and I want to tell it right, because almost none of it has been told before. And that adds to the drama, the archival mystery and quest, all those boxes of manuscripts that Charles Sestra, Thelwall's last biographer back in 1906, somehow lost, maybe during the German occupation of Paris, all the letters that Coleridge destroyed, all the papers that have gone missing, whether through political suppression or sheer bad luck, and all the stuff that has suddenly just turned up. Most recently, his legendary tale, Orlando and Almeida, always thought to have been lost, turns out to have been at New York University all along, as well as 2 great letters from Anna, and as an enthusiastic newlywed Democrat, that John Mee turned up in the National Archives and thinks we should launch at a future Thelwall Society event. And I think it would make a great centerpiece for a conference on radical women. So anybody interested in doing that, come talk to me. But while this biographical blank canvas is an exciting opportunity, it's also an obstacle. Since E.P. Thompson tried and failed to find the Sestra manuscripts, scholars have assumed it would be impossible to write a Thelwall biography. It's not, but it has required a ton of obscure research. And still, I'm afraid that you'll think I'm cutting his life out of whole cloth, to use another fabric metaphor. You'll have to trust me that there are reliable footnotes for all that I'm going to tell you. There's also a problem of imbalance because some parts of the story are almost too well known. Obviously, the political parts, covering only 5 years of his 70, which is all that Sestra was interested in, and that Thelwall's widow was able to publish in 1838 before she gave up her planned 2nd volume, which was going to deal with Thelwall's literary and professional lives. So the whole middle section of my biography is relatively well-trodden ground, though there's still new stuff to reveal. But the last 3 sections cover 35 years, fully half his life, that's almost completely unknown, though it was and will be just as dramatic. What I'm giving you today is excerpts from the first part, his first 25 years, which is covered in Mrs. Thelwall's biography, and I liberally quote that in what follows, but I highlight the theatrical eccentricity that is fundamental to everything that came after. So this is a very different project from the new biography of Charles Lamb that those of you in the Lamb Society heard about from Eric Wilson last month. But the way I'm approaching it is similar to his, with little snippets from the biography and lots of visuals. Before I get into that, inspired by Eric, I want to just devote one slide to a brief comparison between Thelwall and Lamb, as perhaps the best known romantic eccentrics and devotees of theater, as well as lovers of London, urban peripatetics, and humorists. I was really struck by all the parallels during Eric's talk. The last two really jumped out at me because they're so central to what I'm writing right now. Lamb's attraction to the magazine or miscellany format and his use of it as a model for identity, that's exactly my chapter 5. But my favorite parallel is geographical. As we've just heard, the temple, where Lamb lived as a child, had a huge impact on what Eric calls his dispositional doubleness, due to its juxtaposition of the bustling streets outside and the oasis of pastoral serenity inside. That too matches Thelwall, only I talk about it between bustling Covent Garden and serene Walcott Place, the family cottage in Lambeth in what was then open fields. But even more striking, the temple is where Thelwall went to work every day in the mid-1780s, when he was a law student at John Impey's law office in Inner Temple Lane. He was around 20 years old, Charles Lamb 10 years younger, but it is possible they saw one another. Of course, Thelwall was not like one of those old benchers that the essays of Elia remember. He would have just been a random passerby. Still, it's one of those serendipitous juxtapositions that keep happening to tease me out of thought and make this biography so much fun to write, and I hope to read. Okay, on to the snippets I promised. I'll start with the epigraph to chapter 1, the final stanza of Thelwall's comic 1822 autobiography, which he says has been wove double proof in the motley woof of their up and down friend, John Thelwall. So, the motley fabric of John Thelwall's life was first woven in Covent Garden, the motley heart of 18th century London. With its bustling piazza and market, Turkish baths and brothels, theaters and print shops, artists and artisans' workshops, coffee houses, bookstores, aristocrats, beggars, makers, buyers, and sellers of everything under the sun, Covent Garden was as eclectic and eccentric as Thelwall himself. A directory of the family neighbors in Chandos Street, that's down the bottom left of the map, at the time of his birth, 1764, lists 4 mercers, a hosier, 2 musical instrument makers, a jeweler, a portrait painter, and a coachmaker. This captures the miscellaneity that fed his polymathic personality and 2 passions in particular, performance and politics. Indeed, the site of his christening, St. Paul's Covent Garden, is now known as the Actors' Church, due to its numerous memorials to theater personalities, starting with the long-lived 18th century luminary Charles Macklin, who revolutionized speech on stage. And under its distinctive portico, 150 years later, George Bernard Shaw would set the opening scene of his comedy on the politics of speech, Pygmalion. He chose that site because it had long been a symbol of popular democracy, having served as the hustings for the city and liberties of Westminster, the sole constituency in Britain in which all male householders had a vote. And so the precursor of Shaw's Henry Higgins, the man who would give voice to the voiceless, grew up hearing tongues, both eloquent and raucous, raised in debate, song, drama, riot, sensibility, opposition, aspiration, and independence. Though he would range far from his tradesman's upbringing into political notoriety as a democrat, peripatetic citizen of the world, Thelwall's heart was at home in London. His character shaped by it as truly as any of the Cockney contemporaries whose energies, interests, and networks he shared. The visionary artist, William Blake, the radical tailor, Francis Place, the eccentric essayist, Charles Lamb, the poet surgeon, John Keats, and the gadfly journalist, Leigh Hunt. They all knew one another, and like all of them, he embodied the theatricality of Covent Garden itself, combining sentimental idealism and plucky pragmatism, earthy egalitarianism and driving ambition into a story of fortune won and lost that spans the age and spirit of Henry Fielding and David Garrick, Edmund Kean, and Charles Dickens. Thelwall was born at a time of relative peace and prosperity after the end of the 7 Years' War, when his father Joseph, like many others, migrated to the metropolis. He'd come from Leeds to work in his uncle's very successful silk business at the Hen and Chickens on Henrietta Street. And note the date there. Little John, it's 1764, November. Little John would have been just 4 months old. Kind of like this picture, not his real portrait, but hey, it looks like he's already holding that manuscript. Now, at this point in the biography, I go into more detail about Thelwall's family, some of whose members were eccentric or theatrical, especially Walter, his swashbucklingly humanitarian role model of a grandfather, a naval surgeon. But there's no time for that now, but I will say a few words about his great uncles, the Hinchlifes, high-class silk mercers whose shop served His Majesty's wardrobe, and no doubt that of the Theatre Royal, as in my vignette. Their drama came in the form of what can only be called a flame war, 18th century style, in newspaper ads in 1772 between William Hinchliffe, the head honcho at the Hen and Chickens, and his dead brother's widow, who set up a rival business with his share of the stock under the sign of the, I kid you not, Hen and Chickens and 7 Stars, which was just around the corner on Bedford Street, and she proceeded to undercut her brother-in-law. It was quite the kerfuffle. Her ads played up her sensibility, wonderful puns on mercy, mercery, and mercenary, and he got more and more apoplectic in reply. Sadly, the collateral damage seems to have fallen on the apparent peacemaker, Joseph Thelwall, John's father. Just 2 weeks after the widow Hinchliffe went offline in late November 1772, Joseph advertised the opening of his own shop, probably with her remaining stock, at the Sign of the Lamb around the next corner. But he didn't get to enjoy his success. Less than 3 months after, he was dead. We don't know what of, but he was only 42, and it may be that the stress of domestic discord took its toll. In any case, this was a life-defining trauma for young John, who was only 9 years old, as it plunged the fortunes of the entire family into, quote, embarrassment and ruin. Essentially, the widow Thelwall decided to follow the example of the widow Hinchliffe and went into business herself, taking her eldest son, John's brother William, as a partner. Not a good plan. For William's, quote, habits of dissipation produced or aggravated an epileptic disease that ultimately affected his intellects. Under his financial mismanagement and emotional instability, the shop failed and was sold at a loss in the early 1780s, leaving the family virtually destitute and in danger of debtor's prison. Deprived of both father and inheritance, young John felt the impact quite literally as he was beaten by both his mother and brother. This in turn exacerbated his disabilities, a hereditary asthma, speech impediment, and heart condition, which contributed to the depression that fell upon him after the death of his father, and in some measure remained throughout his life. Fortunately, he had inherited his father's cheerful nature and proved remarkably resilient, responding to adversity with the irrepressible energy and iron will that led him to overcome his illness and support the family almost single-handedly through his pen alone, but by his early 20s. Nevertheless, he struggled with bouts of despondency and exhaustion all his life. Indeed, the almost manic intensity of his determination to succeed on his own terms, alternating with periods of breakdown requiring retreat to the country, suggests that his up and down character might today be diagnosed as a form of bipolar disorder. Another lifelong legacy of Joseph Thelwall's death and family discord was John's search for surrogate parents and a motif of brotherhood betrayed. Again, I talk further in the biography about how this shapes and shadows his later political and literary theory and practice. You can easily see it, though, in his best known poem, Lines Written at Bridgewater, to his best known brother and betrayer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. But the most critical result of sudden death and destitution in the life of John Thelwall was to draw a sharp line between his happy childhood and his turbulent adolescence, a dynamic whose intensity and impact compare in many ways with Charles Dickens's childhood experience in the blacking factory. Thelwall's father had shared his youngest son's creative interests, kindling his rage for theatricals by taking him to see Garrick in Richard III when he was 7 years old. When his loving encouragement was replaced by what Thelwall called a tyranny of corporal punishment and emotional manipulation by judgmental relatives and authority figures, he responded with increasingly passionate and principled resistance, caught in a conflict between his affectionate nature and a defiant independence that went beyond adolescent angst. It left him with the lifelong indignation at narrow-minded convention and institutional injustice, and the lifelong passion for self-education and pedagogical reform that led him to make accessible, inclusive public schooling an integral part of his radical political vision. His own schooling had begun under the heavy hand of a Reverend Mr. Pierce, and then with even more ferocious schoolmaster named Mr. Dick, not like the one in David Copperfield, more like sadistic Mr. Murdstone in Dickens's novel. Of him, Thelwall said that almost all he learned was to glory in returning from the severest castigations without a tear. Dick lived at number 12 Little Hearts steps from the family home on King Street, and one can imagine John at the age of 7 or so, having been newly breeched in both senses of the word, that is, wearing his first trousers and also having just been flogged, gingerly walking home through the piazza while attempting to hide both his tender behind and his tender feelings under a facade of dark, dauntless manhood. At the age of 7, his dad would have soothed those blows, but after his dad's death, John's depression, quote, was attended with a correspondent debility of constitution, aggravated by the usual remedy of pedagogues. Apparently, the schoolmasters interpreted his grief as, quote, tardiness and inaptitude, considering him to be of slow and even feeble mind. Nevertheless, someone in the family retained enough hope or desperation to send John, aged 10, to a boarding school in Highgate, in what was then the countryside 5 miles north of Covent Garden, which proved transformative in his development. This is likely to have been Highgate School, founded in 1565 and the only such establishment in the area at that time. Now a prestigious old public school, it remains a landmark in a village that grew increasingly prosperous and busy through the 18th century. Its scenic views of the city below attracted genteel and even aristocratic residents, such as the Earl of Mansfield, a Lord Chief Justice, legal reformer, and parliamentary orator, whom Thelwall would revere during the period of his legal studies a few years later. Mansfield, who lived at Kenwood House just west of Highgate, was one of the governors of the school and rented pews for his family and servants at its chapel, which was the only church in the village. This meant that during his 3 years there, Thelwall would have seen and possibly even met Dido Bell, Mansfield's adopted great niece, a mixed-race Creole beauty who attracted much attention for her cultured yet spirited manners and intelligence. In recent years, of course, she has attracted even more attention, as has Mansfield, for his groundbreaking legal judgments that led to the abolition of slavery in England. Of course, both of them were way above Thelwall's class socially, but she was only 3 years older than he was, the same age as his sister. And if she was as pretty and vivacious as she was remembered to have been, I kind of think he would have noticed her in Sunday service. Under these circumstances, it is probable that Highgate School contributed to the fervent abolitionism that Thelwall developed in his later teens, and in particular influenced his 1801 feminist abolitionist novel, The Daughter of Adoption, whose title character, a cultured and assertive Creole, like Dido Bell crossed with Mary Wollstonecraft, travels from the West Indies to England, where she ends up reforming the slave-owning patriarchy, just as Bell does in the movie, with the assistance of a law student love interest, who is a complete Hollywood fabrication, as is the part about them intervening in the case of the notorious Zong massacre. Didn't happen. But that is another of those fascinating juxtapositions, because a radical abolitionist law student is exactly what Thelwall was at the time of the Zong case, 1783, which he would definitely have followed. Not that the filmmakers could have known that, but it is interesting that they felt the need to invent someone like Thelwall in order to give the needed drama to the movie. Another important feature of Highgate for Thelwall was that he found there a surrogate older brother in the tutor to whom the headmaster left the teaching. His name was Harvey, and even though he stayed for less than 3 months at Highgate School, he had a huge impact on Thelwall, quote, waking the first spark and fanning the ethereal flame. Young and high-spirited, he was, quote, remarkably lax in everything that looked like scholastic discipline, but directed attention rather to multiplying the ideas than cramping the limbs of his pupils. His most influential lesson was his attention to the spoken word. Unconventionally turned the room into a place for amicable conversation, encouraged the boys to inquire, and formed them into discussion groups, allowed to choose their own books. This later became Thelwall's own modus operandi. Just as crucial was Harvey's attention to the management of voice and lungs, anticipating the therapeutic methods that Thelwall would make his own. Essentially, Harvey began a training that would lead Thelwall over the next few years to overcome his lisp and asthma, so that by the time he was 30, he was one of the most, if not the most powerful orator in Britain. And by 50, the world's first speech therapist with a fully developed theory and practice based on the poetics of the spoken word. It's likely that Harvey also heightened Thelwall's rage for theatricals, for he remembered spending much of his recreational time at Highgate declaiming, painting scenes, fabricating theatrical decorations, and rehearsing plays. And he even, quote, trained a sort of corps dramatique of which he was the Rossius. A highlight was when he was, quote, allowed at the age of 13 to play Altamont to the fair penitent of a young lady his own age at a ladies' boarding school in the neighborhood. This is a jaw-dropping revelation, given the scandal caused by young men and women together performing home theatricals in Jane Austen's Mansfield Park. Even allowing that moral attitudes may have been more lax in the 1770s, it's hard to believe that any school of that time would allow such gender mixing, especially among 13-year-olds, and even more so staging The Fair Penitent, a daring restoration she tragedy about sexual infidelity and seduction, I mean, this is where Lothario, the stereotype rake character, comes from. And it's the play that Samuel Richardson based his monumental novel of rape, Clarissa, on. It is slightly more understandable, perhaps, considering that the author of the play, Nicholas Rowe, was an alumnus of Highgate School. The Fair Penitent had a formative influence on young Thelwall. Not only did it have a strong and in some ways proto-feminist heroine in Callista, but there was a subplot of equal intensity highlighting fidelity and betrayal between fathers and brothers, important Thelwallian theme. At his impressionable age, and in accordance with the theatrical elocutionary pedagogy of emulation that he learned from Harvey, by which the mouth of any speaker must match the mind of the author and or character they are reading aloud, Thelwall would have internalized the words and virtues of Callista's tender-hearted husband, Altamont, and used them to shape his own developing character and moral universe. Such an identification with Rowe's play is evident in Thelwall's first ethical romances, a flurry of poems focusing sympathetically on seduced women and criticizing the men who fail them, that issued from his pen over the next 10 years. Basically, it's like Consent and Being an Ally, 1780s style. Again, I talk more about that in the full biography, along with the question of whether or not Thelwall was what we would call a feminist. Not long after this, at the age of 13, Thelwall was withdrawn from Highgate School and put to work, first behind the counter of the family shop, and then as apprentice to a tailor. This was no more than might be expected for a boy of his age and social class to take a man's role in helping family finances, but he bitterly resented being removed from the habits and aspirations that had been stimulated by both his father and Harvey, and thrust into a world of trade where, he complained, the only books that anyone looked at were ledgers, and he was chastised with increasing severity by those who regarded his eccentric creativity as mere idleness and obstinacy. This was the beginning of perhaps the lowest period of his up and down life, a horror that would drive his stubborn independence and underlie his knee-jerk defensiveness about being patronized or attacked as a lacking a classical education, as he would indeed by reviewers, rivals, satirists, and even scholars forever after. These class anxieties are already evident in his first published poems in 1787, in a series of autobiographical elegies in which he identifies himself with the mute, inglorious Milton of Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard, fearing that he is fated to bloom unseen, forever denied the fame for which he longs, excluded from academic groves, and deathless classics never taught, but instead forced to ply some low mechanic art. Indeed, this explains why his first of many autobiographies took an elegiac form. In his later tongue-in-cheek autobiography, Thelwall summed up the apprenticeship phase of his education as follows: "Now measuring of silk and serve and filk with attitude theatrical, and now taking a stitch in vest or breech with poetic flights erratical." At least initially, his family seems to have shown some indulgence of his intellectual interests, as long as he pursued them in his leisure time as an amusement. He overcompensated by reading in every spare moment, devouring the miscellaneous contents of circulating libraries, plays, poetry, history, moral and natural philosophy, metaphysics, divinity, even while walking through the streets of London at night, carrying a candle in one hand, a book in the other. My recent research into his ethical romances has shown how incredibly well-read he was at this early stage, despite, or perhaps because of, his lack of a classical education. He not only quoted from or alluded to translations of Ovid, Tasso, Boccaccio, Ariosto, Chaucer, Spenser, Davenant, Drayton, Dryden, Godolphin, Milton, Shakespeare, and all the recent or living poets, but British history from the Romans forward, Anglo-Saxon etymology, and continental European romance cycles like the Amadis de Gaul. At this time, he also pursued his artistic ambitions, copying prints and doing the fine cut paper compositions that were fashionable at the time, showing a dexterity and delicacy of taste and hand that never left him. These are not by him, by the way, they're just to give you some idea of the amazing delicacy of this type of art. While this part of Thelwall's polymathic character is the least known, it remained important, and such fragments of his artwork as survive show his skill, and all these drawings are his. But the activity that brought together all Thelwall's varied skills and interests was theater. Upon returning from Highgate, he continued to work on plays and somehow convinced his mother to let him convert the family shop after hours into a stage where he and his companions performed Barbarossa, which he had abridged and altered to a fair-sized audience. No doubt these efforts were assisted by Elizabeth Young, though I have no idea whether she would have gone so far and to perform in it, as I put it in my vignette. You know, probably not. I mean, she was a star. She was one of the leading actresses before Sarah Siddons burst on the scene in 1782. But she had risen from working class origins and actually labored as a milliner to support herself while devoting herself to poetry and especially Shakespeare as a young woman. So she would surely have sympathized with young Thelwall's situation. She probably encouraged his efforts at this time to become a professional actor. Sadly, the theater manager to whom he applied curtly turned him down on account of both his lisp and his want of figure. He was basically too short. But as with every other disappointment, Thelwall didn't so much give up as rechannel his rage for theatricals into new forms. First performed in 1754 and restaged regularly thereafter, Barbarossa was synonymous with the great David Garrick, who premiered the part of its young hero Selim and wrote its prologue and epilogue, which Thelwall later adapted actually for one of his own theatrical prologues, of which he wrote quite a few. A brilliant actor-manager, Garrick revolutionized the art of theater. He hired a noted artist from France to do pioneering stage design, presided over the creation of Shakespeare as a national icon, and ushered in the cult of the celebrity actor. Hogarth's portrait of him as Richard III on the slide was the most widely reproduced theatrical print of the age. I bet it was on the wall in the Thelwall family home. And fans of all social classes mimicked Garrick in the popular spouting clubs at which, Thelwall too attended. According to the European magazine, Garrick was the very glass wherein the noblest youth did dress themselves. There were no legs that practiced not his gait, no eyes that practiced not his looks. Garrick may thus be seen as another of Thelwall's father surrogates. Although it's unlikely they met personally, in choosing Barbarossa to stage at home, Thelwall shaped his identity in Garrick's image, fusing artist, actor, director, and writer. Even more than the fair penitent, the germ of his later principles and preoccupations may be found in the romance of Selim, the Ottoman prince whose father is murdered by the tyrant usurper Barbarossa, and who returns from exile to liberate his mother and redeem his people. Here again, young Thelwall probably identified the play with his own family situation, especially because this play focuses on the intense and ambivalent relationship between a strong-minded widow and the son who both honors and challenges her. Even more strikingly, the themes, motifs, and character types of Barbarossa reappear in his later work: spies and informers, exile and return, the power of the name, the shackling and liberation of the tongue, the citizen and the friend, the savior in disguise. Above all, the duplicity of young Selim, at once a metamorphic trickster who tests the truth by performing lies, and a sentimental hero who prevails through his heart rather than his sword, captures the two faces of Thelwall throughout his career, a slippery, seditious allegorist and the sentimental champion of the people. Barbarossa is one of many 18th century plays that exploited Britain's imperialist fascination with exotic cultures, both Muslim and Native American, and used them to comment on domestic politics. One of the most interesting features of these plays were their strong heroines, like Sapphira, whom Bridget Orr calls fair captives, whose stalwart resistance to tyranny was intended to represent British liberty on one hand and the power of sentiment on the other. Thelwall would have been familiar with these plays, especially because Miss Young took the lead in two of the most popular right around the time he was adapting Barbarossa, Zara, set in the Ottoman Empire, and Alzira, set among the Incas in South America. Thelwall adopted the latter in particular for both his own ambitious but ill-fated unstaged dramas of 1787 and 92, Incalinarico and the Incas. I do not have time to deal with them in detail here, but I want to finish this talk by highlighting features common to both plays that show where his eccentric theatricality would lead. First, when I say ill-fated, I refer to the fact that although these plays weren't staged in Thelwall's name, they both became huge hits for other people after he had submitted his scripts and they were withheld by the theater managers, who went on to stage remarkably similar plays instead. Now, the editors of Thelwall's plays suggest that there's not enough evidence to support the charges of plagiarism that Thelwall made at the time. I'm not sure about that. I kind of agree with the case that Susanna Thelwall makes in this. This is one of the letters that John Mee found. But leaving that aside, the style of both plays is certainly more appealing to a modern audience in not only their satire and humor, but their versification and voice. This is especially notable in his opera, The Incas. Even though no music has survived and it has never been performed, the musical modulations of its language are striking, as Thelwall interweaves and multiplies voices that represent different positions, who appear to sing at the same time to the same tune and using many of the same phrases and rhymes, but with opposite keywords that play out dramatic and ideological conflicts. Its remarkable verbal polyphony or layered counterpoint reminds me of the lyrical ballad between Javert and Valjean in Les Mis, if you know that one, but multiplied tenfold at the climax, as in the great anthem of Les Mis, One More Day, you know, with all the voices coming in. I'd love to see this play by Thelwall performed. But at our current moment, probably the most exciting shared feature of Thelwall's early plays is their transatlantic perspective that can only be called proto-post-colonial. He builds on the tradition of colonial contact plays like Alzira by exploiting their sensationalism and cultural stereotypes for social commentary and satire, while turning the tables ideologically. So in Incalinarico, the so-called savages teach a moral lesson to the so-called civilized colonizers, as the would-be slave traders are enslaved themselves. And in his other play, the Incas actually defeat the Spanish in a counterfactual reversal of the 1781 rebellion of Tupac Amaru II. As Michael Scrivener says, it is as though the Amerindian uprisings in the Andes had succeeded, rather than resulting in the torture and mutilation of the rebel leaders and the slaughter of over 100,000 Native Americans. In both plays, Thelwall places strong defenses of liberty racial and gender equality in the mouths of female, indigenous, and lower class characters. In so doing, he was influenced by the debating societies that were integrally related to his youthful rage for theatricals. Taking the place of the university in his development, these ambitious venues of public education were, like him, unfairly ridiculed in their own time and overlooked in ours. Strikingly, debates about abolition and gender rights intersected in those societies during the 1780s. To illustrate, let me end now with a newspaper ad for a debate held in 1788 at the Westminster Forum, a society in which Thelwall played a leading role. It said that a native of Africa, many years a slave in the West Indies, will attend and speak about his experience. Most likely that's Olaudah Equiano, who addressed several debating societies in advance of the publication of his famous interesting narrative in the revolutionary year 1789, and who would soon be a colleague of Thelwall's in the radical London Corresponding Society. After a few sentences outlining his proposed subject, the ad ends by introducing a lady whose intellectual accomplishments and wonderful powers of eloquence have already gained her the highest respect, and who is also expected to speak to the question. She sounds exactly like the lady to whom Thelwall had paid tribute at the same Westminster Forum only a month earlier by performing a speech in rhyme that single-handedly enacted an entire debate between four men, followed by a woman who wins the contest handily by systematically yet gracefully dismantling their arguments. Here, Thelwall's eccentric theatricality meets his feminist, abolitionist, anti-imperialist political activism as he takes the next steps in a career of giving voice to the voiceless. Thanks.
Thank you, Judith. Bravo, Judith. That was fantastic and really whetted our appetite for the biography. When might we expect that? Do you have a kind of ETA or not?
That's the hard part. I'm a very slow writer, so I mean it's coming along, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe next year at this time, but then there's the whole exigencies of the press. I don't know.
Of course. Well, we look forward to it whenever it appears. Thank you very much, Judith. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Felicity, who's going to chair the question and answer session. So, Felicity.
Yes, just to echo John's thanks there. That was marvellous, Judith. It was just great to have a glimpse of the biography, those tempting parallels between Charles Lamb and John Thelwall, that ambiguous home that they both have in Covent Garden, in the Inner Temple and Middle Temple, and their ambiguous class status as well. So it was just fascinating. Thank you. Can I open it up to questions and ask if anybody is